2022. I was in Kiev, Ukraine, and then I was invited to work at the University of Münster and then to the University of Exeter. Why I'm here is because in Ukraine, from 2016 until 2022, basically, I've been involved in peace building and dialogue work. I was a coordinator of the Dialogue in Action project that brought together local religious activists and civic activists in order to promote the culture of dialogue and peace within Ukraine internally. At the moment, at the University of Exeter, I'm doing a totally different project which concerns the social message or social ethos of icons and icon-like images that appear in Ukraine now during the wartime with references to the ongoing war. However, since the time when I left first to Germany and then to Exeter, I had an opportunity to read Western literature on peace building, both in the context of the church or religious peace building and secular peace building. And because this topic has been, well, something very important and personal, I gave a lecture on this at the Exeter University for the students, and basically what I'm going to present now is also my reflections on this theory of peace building and the Ukrainian case. And I will do it basically in three parts. First, some general remarks on peace building and its relevance to Ukraine, then religious peace building, and the challenges that I feel are relevant also to the situation at home. As I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are here in the context of what peace building is generally, right? Do I understand things right? Can someone probably comment?
Yep, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I think, yep.
Yeah, okay. Because I wasn't able to be present at the summer school because I'm myself now a student of another summer school in Greece. So pretty much I'm not in the context of what's going on, which, well, which is a pity because I like to be able to respond to what was said already. Then I will not stop at some more theoretical things as long as I could have. What is important to say, and again, I'm saying this having spent this a year and a half in the West and having talked to people who are involved in religious peace building in the West, is that the peace building paradigm in 1960s, 1970s, well, in the context of post Second World War and Cold War and post Cold War, had a conflict in mind, which was a different kind of conflict than the one that we have in Ukraine. You're certainly, I guess, are acquainted with who John Paul Lederach is, right? Are you?
Some are.
Some are, okay. Well, I was a person who edited his classical book, Building Peace, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Communities in Ukrainian and also in Russian languages. It was published in the publishing house where I worked. This was in 2017, 2018. The book, which this is now important for me, it started with a definition of the contemporary conflict, which I guess then developed, was crucial in developing responses to contemporary conflict. And the features of this contemporary conflict were certain features which not necessarily coincide with the Ukrainian case. And this is, I think, a big part of the problem with peace building and Ukraine right now. So according to Lederach's approach, and this was a book which he wrote in 1990s, and this was the conclusion of his very rich peace-building work in Nicaragua, Colombia, the Philippines, Nepal, countries in East and West Africa, and Northern Ireland. So the idea of the contemporary conflict presented in that book was that the conflict happens in the margins of world community in Africa, Central America, Asia. The conflict is caused by social inequities and underdevelopment. The conflict happens along group identity lines like ethnicity, religion, or race, which means that your nearest neighbor may be your enemy and not someone living in the different territory. The kind of the conflict is internal and internationalized conflict, in which psychological and cultural features often drive and sustain the conflict more than immediate substantive issues. And the mechanism of solution is a weapon of such a conflict. And then the solution to such a contemporary conflict that he offered was a comprehensive, integrative, strategic approach to the transformation of conflict in a non-violent way, without weapon, which would involve the infrastructure across all levels of society and not only top leadership and state diplomacy. An infrastructure that would empower the resources for reconciliation from within that society and maximize the contribution from outside. And in short, he said, constructing the House of Peace would rely on a foundation of multiple actors and activities aimed at achieving and sustaining reconciliation, which he defined as a point of encounter where concerns about both the past and the future can meet. Yeah. And reconciliation, which would be in the heart of this peace-building work, would take into account personal experience, feelings, needs. It couldn't be forced. He recognized that it needs space and time in the present, involves the past and the future together, it needs personal work, and its cornerstones would be truth, mercy, justice, and peace. And the key statement of that book was that peace-building work is most effective when it is done from the middle range level of society, which has access both to the top level of society and the basis of society. So it would be this middle structure of the pyramid that would be the key actor of reconciliation. And well, when I will come to my next part of the presentation on religion, it will be clear that religion basically is situated on that level of transforming conflict from this middle range approach. And he used, for example, one of the examples of the middle range solution for international conflict within this framework of peace building and sustainable reconciliation, the Norwegian channel or the Oslo channel. And actually, in the context of Ukraine, I find the Sustainable Peace Manifesto, Never Again 2.1, the World After Our Victory, an attempt to peace building from this Middle Age approach. It was produced by Ukrainian intellectuals a few months ago, who, being in this middle range, felt themselves eligible to be representatives of the Ukrainian civil society and address both the Ukrainian top level and the international level in order to imagine the peace and the relationship of Ukraine with other countries after the war, the just peace for Ukraine. Yeah, and this is the nowadays classical definition of peace building beyond status diplomacy as the creation and nurturing of constructive relationships across ethnic, religious, class, and racial boundaries, which seeks to resolve social inequities and transform structural conditions that generate deadly conflict. This work spans the entire conflict cycle and includes conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict resolution and transformation, and post-conflict reconciliation. And okay, when I was still in Ukraine, and especially later, I was thinking about this a lot. And then I came out with the following question. I showed you this in this first slide, the features of contemporary conflict, and I just tried to compare, it's very easy, these features with the features of Ukrainian conflict, of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And my questions were, is the war in Ukraine identical to the contemporary conflict paradigm that peace building, this classical peace building used? I think no. Is the conflict on the margins of the world? No, it's in the heart of Europe. Is it about poverty, inequities, and underdevelopment? Well, basically, no. It's about certain ideologies. Is it an internal, internationalized conflict? Well, this is how the international peace building community used to see it, I think, from 2014. However, this picture changed in 2022 because it is clearly an international conflict. Is it a conflict along ethnic, religious, racial lines? Well, partly so, but not entirely. Can it be settled without weapon? Hardly. And can we apply the same peace-building strategies in the Ukrainian case, the peace-building strategies which actually stemmed from the vision of the contemporary conflict, which is used in peace-building? Not so sure. Possibly it's better applicable to the intra-Ukrainian context than to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict context, where we could apply this approach in the post-conflict situation, but not at the moment. Then the second part of my presentation is about religion and peace building. The main question in the 20th century, well, basically also in the 21st century, is whether religion is a cause of violence or a cause of peace and non-violence. And of course, there exist and have existed a range of answers to this question. In the 20th century, within the framework of the statist diplomacy, within the Enlightenment paradigm of religion and violence, the European and American international diplomacy has tended to think that the problem was religion, which incites violence, and it is a source of deep and irreconcilable differences, irrational differences among individuals, communities, and peoples. And basically, if you remove religion from relations between states, people, communities, and individuals, there will be less violence. So the solution is to minimize differences among individuals, communities, and peoples in conflict. Seek to minimize the presence or influence of religion in any process of diplomacy or peace. And then in 1996, there appeared this Clash of Civilizations essay by Samuel Huntington, who said that, however, that people's cultural and religious identities will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War era. And indeed, then happened in 2001, the September 11, which showed that you cannot go without religion. And the terroristic attack was interpreted basically in the framework, well, not by everyone, but by many, as the manifestation of this conflict of civilizations. However, then the response to this vision was the work of international religious peace builders and peace scholars who would say that no, it's wrong. You cannot identify religion with conflict, even in Islam. And eventually, a booming of religion peace building took place in early 2000s, which, well, factually showed that this is not true to identify religion and violence. And then there appeared the Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, in 2007, where he said that it is wrong, well, I'm simplifying things, but to identify Western type of enlightenment in the world with the disappearance of religion, as we see the steady persistence of religion since the enlightenment, globally, and the global expansion of religions at the very same time that Western civilization rational discourses have extended around the globe. And then William Cavano published The Myth of Religious Violence in 2009, stating that the term religion in itself is a construction of post-Enlightenment rationalism, which means that, we cannot identify, again, as something as solely religious violence, since religion itself, what is religion itself, is a big question. And then in 2000, there was this book by Scott Appleby, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion, Violence, and Reconciliation, in which religion was identified as a response to the sacred that can generate ambivalent and not just positive or negative phenomena or responses ranging from violent to non-violent militancy. And this was, so to speak, the justification for positive view on religion after such a long time of the negative view on religion within the peace-building secular, let's say, peace-building framework. It is this insight that religion is an ambivalent phenomena that sparked the industry of religious peace-building and carved out space for a theological and hermeneutical focus on peace-promoting motives and resources within religious traditions. And then a whole range of peace-building institutions, religious peace-building institutions appeared, including organizations, research centers, single traditional or ecumenical peace-building networks. For example, in Ukraine, our project Dialogue in Action cooperated a lot with the Mennonite Central Committee in Zaporizhia, who sponsored but also participated in the programs that we developed for religious and secular leaders. Then there are Quakers, there are Catholics, there is the Orthodox Peace Fellowship, and I know its director, and I had discussions with him at the Orthodox Peace Conference in January concerning the difficulties in the Ukrainian case. There are ecumenical interventions, there are research institutions, and there are really many of them. And also, at the same time, just peace, similar ideas are now present in social teachings of Christian churches. I assume you had a lecture on the Catholic peace and violence and war teaching before. I was the translator of the social ethos document of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church. It is called For the Life of the World Towards the Social Ethos of Orthodox Church, published by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, which is the part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which has the section devoted to peace, war, and violence, and which is very much, I would say, inspired by just peace ideas, which have been dominating in the general framework of peace building. And it is very different from the Russian social doctrine, whose chapter on war, peace, and violence is not as much oriented as at peace building. That document, Russian doctrine, dates back to 2000. So the paths that religion now has in peace building are the following. So the retrieval of peace from inside the religion, so promoting motives from within the resources of individual religious traditions and developing the so-called theologies of peace, extracting theologies of peace of each of the religious traditions, interfaith dialogues which use those theologies of peace in order to find contact, civil religious dialogues which again rely on the theologies of peace extracted from religious traditions, religious networks, and faith diplomacy, which can be characterized as in a very multiple ways. And I have here slides as just examples of peace theologies used in peace buildings. This is in Islam. theology of peace in Islam values, principles, and practices that inform an Islamic understanding of peace and nonviolence. Then the famous book by John Paul Lederach, Reconcile, which is in a way a religious militancy of the Christian tradition. John Paul Lederach, whom I mentioned, is a Mennonite who applied his the convictions of his peace church to practical social work, and this book is the explanation of his motives from within, let's say, and the cornerstone of this work is of this book and his work is an ethic based on willingness to make an ultimate sacrifice for an enemy, and this is the cornerstone of all peace churches, which we can coin as religious militancy. So this is the extreme version of the theology of peace in Christianity, I would say. And I love this book, actually. Yeah, this is again him. This is also from the Reconcile book. He, in his work, in his practical work, he uses the concepts of Psalm 58, truth, justice, mercy. These personifications which people play with in order to dialogue and negotiate in conflict situation. He uses this during his trainings and conflict transformation workshops and when he works in the field. Peace theologies, there are attempts, successful and unsuccessful, to apply peace theologies to the sphere of the political. So they do not necessarily have to remain on the level of interreligious or religious encounters. But for example, Daniel Philpott claims that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all those religious traditions, can apply their peace theologies to political reconciliation, which would be deeply rooted in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For example, it's the restorative justice movement. And he says that this can be successfully applied to modern constitutional democracy. And he developed 6 practices: building just institutions and relations between states, acknowledgement, reparations, restorative punishment, apology, and most important, forgiveness, which can be applied to real cases and which are shared by those traditions. And in this way, religious traditions can work in the political. And he describes cases from Bosnia, Iraq, South Africa, Germany, Sierra Leone, and other places. And the paradigmatic case of applying the the theology of peace to the sphere of political is, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in 1996, where we had Desmond Tutu as a religious figure working in the public field. However, religious peace building, and this is very important for me now, is a challenging one, because attempts of religious peace building can lead to positive effects, that they can also unfortunately do harm. And the main challenge of this religious peace building work is essentializing religion. So when we render religion as an ahistorical, monolithic, and unchanging essence, we produce simplistic and deterministic pictures. And when approaching concrete conflict situation, we can bring harm. So Atalia Omer says that it is not about religions in abstraction as systems of meanings informing behavior, but as interpreted and embodied in the complex interplay between social practices and institutional formations. In other words, there is no such a thing as as abstract religion. It is always embodied. It is always an interplay between social practices and institutional formations. And this is how religions should be approached, both when we speak of religious violence and religious peace building. So, for example, my current focus in research now is icons, Orthodox icons. And an ahistoric approach to an icon would be that, icon always speaks about God, Mother of God, saints, the gospel, mystery, something good, something eternally good. But in the situation of the current conflict, we see that icons can be used in different ways. For example, the upper image shows Patriarch Kirill blessing the war, and this was actually on the Feast of the Triumph of Orthodoxy. This is the Feast of Icons in Orthodoxy in 2022, blessing the war with the icon. And there exists such a tradition. And icons, unfortunately, not only in the Russian war now, but also in the Byzantine history, were also often used to bless military actions. And below you see the icons scratched by prisoners, Ukrainian prisoners in Russian torture chambers in Vovchansk, in Kharkiv region, and both are icons. So in the current war, we see that icons can be instrumentalized and used in different ways. So it's not like whenever we see an icon in the war, it is a sign of peace. No, it can be a sign of war, unfortunately, however surrealistic this may sound. What I'm very, very helpful in this context is thoughts also by John Paul Lederach from his later book, Moral Imagination, where he emphasizes the importance of the relational side in peace building and the importance of confessional quality in peace building. He says, I quote from Moral Imagination, "Breaking violence requires that people embrace a more fundamental truth. Who we have been, are, and will be emerges and shapes itself in the context of relational interdependency." And this is also the core of reconciliation work. It is always in the web of relationships. We cannot do any peace building, we cannot do any reconciliation out of the web of relationships. And we have to recognize that before we do any peace work, this web of relationships, it already exists. And then he says that people do not just take notice of the web of relationships. They situate and recognize themselves as part of the pattern. Patterns of violence are never superseded without acts that have a confessional quality at their base. Which means that if an individual or an organization enters any conflict, it has to understand its own place in this context, in the current context. Yesterday, we had a lecture at my summer school in Greece on WCC and its WCC World Council of Churches and its role in the ecumenical and the role of ecumenism in WCC in relation to Ukraine. And the conclusion was that unless WCC recognizes its own place in the current conflict, which means also recognizing the background of its work with Russia, the absence of its work with Ukraine previously, and also the horizon where it goes, it cannot really bring any positive change. Without confessional quality of, for example, support in Russia for a long time, we cannot, the World Council of Churches, effectively bring the parties together and cause peace among them. So again, Lederach says that most important question is in peace building is what exists and how are we in relationship to it. I keep reading kind of proposals from external parties, even from Orthodox world, for example, in America, kind of advising Ukrainian, Russian, how to behave. And I, being at the same time in the West and Ukraine, can hear and understand both the, wishful thinking, in a good sense, wishful thinking has negative connotation by itself, but I mean, good intentions behind certain peace-building ideas, effort, but I can also understand Ukrainians who resist that because they can feel that those who speak do not really at first clarify their place in the web of relationship in the conflict, and basically therefore they speak on the abstract level. So the bottom line of this is that religious involvement at any level has to be honestly self-reflexive and confessional. And this also, of course, refers to the religious situation, conflict situation within Ukraine. And with that, I mean the conflict between the two Orthodox churches. And I'm a part of the internal dialogue group between certain representatives, not many of them, of Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate still. Again, unless there is this act of recognition of one's own place and confessional quality, there is very little chance to change anything. Then, again, speaking about challenges to religious peace building, this is basically in the same paradigm. The context, we should not only understand our place in the context, but the context itself, when we try to extract those so-called peace theologies from religious and then apply them to a certain conflict situation in order to bring peace. A contextual approach can make interfaith dialogue unjust and utilitarian. For example, is everything okay? Because I see that my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
It's sometimes a little bit incomprehensible, but I think I can hear you well so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is the best setting that I could find in this city, really. So
For me, it's just a little glitch sometimes, but that's all.
Okay, thank you. So when we try to distill ethics of reconciliation from a certain religious tradition, without being aware of context in which it happens, it may be unproductive. So, for example, Atalia Omer, again, she says that if we try to distill an ethics of reconciliation from within Judaism, but ignore the context of the occupation of Israel, the whole situation of Israel and Palestine, our attempts of interfaith dialogue between Jews and Palestinians will not be really effective. Then this is what I experienced a lot in the West, and I myself lived in a pacifist community during the first months of March 2022 in Germany. This Christian religious militancy, it is an ambivalent phenomenon, and to me and to my Ukrainian friends who were living in a very, very welcoming and friendly environment of German pacifist Switzerland in 2022 when we left Ukraine and found ourselves among Germans who were going to those demonstrations against weapons and so on, because the refusal, if we consider, as in religious militancy and pacifism, that war and violence are bad, unfortunately, a refusal to participate in military actions does not always make ourselves more just and merciful towards those who suffer from violence. Because perpetrators and victims are not necessarily violent in the same way as in case of Russians and Ukrainians. And when we try again about this ahistorical approach, a contextual approach, when we try to apply certain Bible stories out of context, Bible stories of reconciliation to a certain context outside of the context of those Bible stories and our own context, it may not be, again, an effective story. And then there is the question of freedom. So when religious militancy becomes sort of violent, I was a witness of a lecture of a Catholic professor at the University of Münster on the situation in German peacebuilding movement in relation to the Ukrainian situation when German, I'm not sure they were all Pax Christi members, but apparently pacifists were kind of, violent towards him because he was pro weapon in case of the Ukrainian context, and they were basically aggressive in their rhetoric towards him, and they were standing in front of the building, not letting people in. And I felt very hurt, and I just left that meeting. So religious militancy that can be very positive when it concerns like welcoming of refugees, when it concerns unconditional love to the enemy, can be violent towards victims of immediate conflict. This, I just felt it on my skin. And you probably, why is it, sorry? You certainly know about the ambivalent, aggressively ambivalent attitude in Ukraine against the Pope Francis's attempt to equalize the suffering of Ukrainians and Russians in the current war, as those pictures here on the screen show. These are pictures from Ukraine. This is how the situation is seen in Ukraine when the Pope tried to make the Ukrainian and the Russian carry the same cross. Let's say the cross is not the same. And again, a sentence from Lederer's book. I appreciate it very much because John Paul Lederer is basically a religious militant, but he has a great experience in the field, and he understands how important it is to be contextual to do any good work. He says that in the Reconcile book, we have to keep our feet on the ground, connected to the challenge of current realities, and we need our head in the clouds with the capacity to live into a new reality of more just, equitable, and peaceful relationships. For me, in this sentence, the first part is very, very important. And I appreciate the work of the Mennonite Central Committee in Ukraine, which, before the war, now they're not in Ukraine, which was very sensitive to the Ukrainian conflict, and from 2014 onwards, we're not trying to kind of judge and condemn Ukrainians because they take part in military resistance, while Mennonites are anti-military, let's say. So, for example, Mennonite Central Committee in Zaporizhia sponsored some initiatives of our Dialogue in Action project that was the work with military chaplains. Trainings for military chaplains, ecumenical trainings, so chaplains from different Christian traditions together to help them better understand their role in their context. And for me, it was interesting and shocking to see that the Mennonites in Germany could not really kind of accept, at least in 2022, this way of thinking that the Mennonites in Zaporizhia could, because they were on the ground. This is very important. Then, again, what I see also in the international peacebuilding efforts around Ukraine from the side of churches is the challenge of the spiritual obligation to reconcile. So religious people who are called to reconciliation. Peace builders often overdo their work, and which John Paul Lederach says that we must recognize that forcing someone into engagements and relationships, which we often do under the rubric of spiritual obligation without fully attending to the preparation and authenticity of the choice, is damaging. So not doing anything is damaging, but do something because you feel spiritually obliged to do something may be damaging. And before doing anything out of spiritual obligation, you should think many times. Also in Ukraine. Well, then one of the challenges in religious peace building is what is called a church trap, a conversion trap, when peace building work is done not of authentic desire for reconciliation and peace building, in which you see yourself as part of this web of relationships and in which you're self-aware, but when your real aim is to teach the gospel and basically evangelize. This is unacceptable in peace building. Well, in Ukraine, I don't really see now such things, although no, well, I do. A lot of humanitarian work, unfortunately, is done with the aim of evangelizing in general in the world. And then, this is very important, structural and cultural violence within a certain faith tradition is a great challenge in any religious peace building. And this I see a lot as an obstacle for reconciliation between the two Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalous one, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Of course, there are political reasons. There is the Russian aggression, and many things, many factors are involved into this conflict. But unfortunately, there is the structural and cultural violence in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which prevents authentic peace dialogue. So when there is and I don't necessarily refer to problems with homosexual violence as in the Catholic Church, and maybe just structural violence of hierarchy towards priests and priests towards laity, kind of manipulation with the idea of obedience in the church. When there is a lot of it, as there is in Ukrainian churches, internally, it necessarily manifests externally. And if you are not peaceful within, you cannot be really peaceful when you go out. And yeah, this is the big obstacle. However, all those religious peace building challenges do not mean that there is no hope for religious peace building. And actually, I'm saying this because at some point, especially when I lived in Germany for a few months, I was very frustrated with the whole idea of peace building and religious peace building, because there was so much of this misunderstanding of what's going on. But then I read this also book by John Paul Lederach, Moral Imagination, in which the question which Lederach asks in this book is, how do we transcend the cycles of violence that bewitch our human community while still living in them? And the answer he gives is that by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build the moral imagination. And the moral imagination is here closely connected with the ability to dream, still within the context of a conflict, of peace. And not to dream abstractly, kind of totally out of reality, but without that ability to imagine things, you cannot get anywhere. So the first book that I showed by Lederach, Building Peace, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Societies, was an attempt to present a model, kind of in comprehensive, integrative, strategic model for peace building in divided societies, a very theoretically informed book based on a lot of experience. However, in this book, Moral Imagination, which appeared later, he says that, well, you can build different frameworks and vast models, but if there is no capacity, no ability to still imagine things and dream and be free of models, let's say, and be open, keep your eyes open, you don't have a chance to do anything. And in that book, he names the 4 disciplines and capacities which are essential for peace-building work. The first one is the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationship which include our enemies. Well, this is in Ukraine almost impossible at the moment because the whole nation wants victory. However, as Yaroslav Hrycak says, our historian, we should imagine already now the strategy of what we are doing when the victory comes. However you understand this victory, it's a complicated question. We should be able to think further, to imagine things further. Then the second factor is the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. The third factor is the fundamental belief in and pursuit of the creative act. And the fourth is the acceptance of the inherent risk, this is very important, of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the too far familiar landscape of violence. Certainly when you live in the very familiar landscape of violence, it's very difficult to imagine anything. However, risk is worthwhile. Even though I myself personally do not agree with the religious militancy in terms of non-military solution to the conflict as Ladder believes. And this is the last slide of my presentation. It's the cover of the Moral Imagination book by Ladder, The Art and Soul of Building Peace. It's a painting on the cover by Kazakh artist Akmal Karol, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. It was painted as a reflection on the events of September 11th, and he commented it in the context of the war in Kazakhstan at that moment. And the artist commented on this on his own painting in the following way: every day we will look toward the sky and wonder what was coming next, and hoping that we could find something better, something to stop it, something to end the bad dream. So the sky is something from which bombs fall on you, but the sky is also something where you can find your dreams. And I don't have, again, concrete answers at the moment, but I want to emphasize this ability in the framework of context of conflict to still leave some room for imagination and for the skies from which answers might come. Thank you.